So we're now going to go to Shereen Benjamin from For Women Scotland. And the question for Shereen is, can you tell us about the judicial review and maybe explain what that is for us?
So this is the judicial review of the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act Scotland, which is a bit of a mouthful. And before I get into that, I just want to say a bit about the distinction between Scotland and the United Kingdom as a whole, because I know some people can get confused about that. So Scotland's a devolved nation within the UK, and what that means in practice is that some laws, some policy areas apply throughout the UK, and the term we use for that is reserved to Westminster. So one example of a law reserved to Westminster is the 2010 Equality Act, which is the one that lists gender reassignment and sex as two separate protected characteristics. So that's UK-wide, that's reserved. Then there's a range of things decided by the Parliament in Holyrood in Edinburgh. So those we call devolved matters. So things like education law, education policy are devolved. And I think a lot of people on this call will know the Gender Recognition Act is devolved. So the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act. So the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act was passed by the Scottish Parliament in 2018. And there's a really good write-up about this on the Fair Play for Women website. I haven't got time to go into all the details of it now. So, I mean, this act was intended to address the underrepresentation of women in public life in Scotland, which is great. And it established a 50% target for non-executive posts on Scottish public boards to be held by women, which is great. And there's measures to make that happen. But of course, for that to work, for it to address the discrimination and the barriers to participation that women face on the basis of sex, the definition of woman matters. And here's how it's defined in the Act for the purposes of this 50% target. Woman includes a person who has the protected characteristic of gender reassignment if and only if the person is living as a woman and is proposing to undergo, is undergoing, or has undergone a process or part of a process for becoming female. So in other words, the definition of woman includes a man who by some unspecified process has become or is becoming female. And if you're familiar with the Equality Act, you'll recognize some of the wording because there's a weird merger here of two distinct protected characteristics, sex and gender reassignment. So in June 2020, the Scottish Government issued statutory guidance to help put this act into practice. And it gives us 3 criteria for a trans woman who doesn't have a GRC, a gender recognition certificate, to count as a woman. So they need to have the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. They need to have reassigned their sex from male to female or be in the process of doing so. And thirdly, they need to be living as a woman. And in case you're wondering what it means to live as a woman, I know I am, here are some of the examples the guidance gives us. Always using female pronouns, using a female name on utility bills or bank accounts, describing themselves and being described by others in written or other communication as a woman, using female titles, so hard luck if you're a doctor or a professor. And in a final twist, the guidance says that the Act doesn't require an appointing person to actually ask a candidate to prove they meet the definition of a woman in the Act. So to recap, the Act's intended to address underrepresentation of women in public life in Scotland, resulting from centuries of discrimination on the basis of sex. And for the purposes of the Act, a woman includes any man who's undergoing or proposing to undergo some undefined process to become female, who uses a female name and titles, but in any case, whoever's making the appointments can't check. So in practical terms, a woman is anyone, male or female, who says they're a woman. So this enshrines into law a new definition of woman that instead of being clear and verifiable and easily understood, is vague and subjective and convoluted. So it takes the protected characteristics of sex and of gender reassignment as set out in the 2010 Equality Act. And just to remind you, the Equality Act is reserved legislation reserved to Westminster, applies across all nations of the UK. It takes those 2 distinct protected characteristics, merges them. And I think it makes a nonsense out of the protected characteristic of sex, arguably gender as well. And if this is allowed to stand without opposition in Scotland, the worry is that it'll give the green light to other parts of the UK to go ahead and also redefine the protected characteristic of sex in other pieces of legislation, which would fatally undermine women's protections via the Equality Act. So that's why we're concerned and we think it applies beyond Scotland. It has huge implications beyond Scotland. So you will be glad to know, if you don't already, and I can't, I was going to go onto our crowdfund site, maybe somebody will put that in the chat. This is being challenged via a judicial review by For Women Scotland. Last year, For Women Scotland successfully applied for a judicial review, and that's going ahead. The substantive hearing is fixed for January the 7th and 8th. So that's this coming Thursday and Friday. If you go onto the crowdfund site, there's lots more information about exactly what we're seeking via the judicial review. So do go and have a look at that. The crowdfund is still open for donations. We think legal costs are going to be in the region of 100,000. So that's still open. I know it's a rubbish time of year to be asking for money, but if you are able to donate, we'd be very grateful for that. I don't know how long it'll take for the outcome of the judicial review to be known. So keep an eye on the For Women Scotland website, and there'll be updates there as soon as anything is known. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.